The day Cersei turned 15, she understood something that made her stomach twist. Jaime was drifting away from her. He had always been hers, her mirror, her shadow, her perfect half. But by then, Jaime had grown quieter, more distant. He laughed, more with their father's bannerman than with her. When she reached for his hand, he'd flinch like the heat between them had become a burn. And when she leaned in one night, bold and breathless, he pulled back, whispering, "We're not children anymore, Cersei." That was the first time she tasted rejection like sour wine in her mouth. She didn't cry. Cersei Lannister never cried where anyone could see. But she didn't sleep that night. She stared at the carved lion on the stone ceiling of Casterly, rock tracing every line of its roaring mouth with her eyes. She would not beg for love, not even from her twin. By the time she was 17, Jaime had joined the Kingsguard. She wasn't surprised. She knew why he did it, not for honor, not for glory, but to escape her, to run to the capital and wrap himself in white so he'd never have to lie in her bed. She hated him for it. Tywin was furious, of course, furious that his heir threw away his birthright for a white cloak. But Cersei's anger ran deeper. It was personal. It cut her in places no one could see. That same year, she was married off to Robert Baratheon. A king, yes, but also a drunk, a brute, and worst of all, a man who loved a ghost, Lyanna Stark. Her name hung in the Red Keep like incense smoke, thick and choking. Every time he touched her, Cersei closed her eyes and thought of Jaime's face. Not out of love, but to dull the disgust. But Jaime wasn't there to comfort her. He wasn't even close. He served Aerys at the time, the Mad King, standing guard while her life bled into cold sheets and hollow glances. By the time Robert left her bed for good, Cersei had learned two things. Men were weak, and love was a weapon, and she was done chasing. Both. Her firstborn child was not Jaime's in this world. It was Robert's, black-haired, screaming, and she hated him on sight. She had dreamt of a golden-haired son, just like her and Jaime, but instead she got a bastard in blood, if not in name. She ordered his wet nurse to keep him out of her chambers. She named him Maelon, but never spoke the name aloud. The court saw her as cold. Robert called her barren of heart, but they didn't understand what it meant to be Cersei Lannister, stripped of the only love she ever wanted. So she turned to power. She learned to manipulate Varys with whispered rumors. She watched Littlefinger like a hawk and stole his secrets before he knew they were gone. She played Grand Maester Pycelle like a rusty fiddle. And when Ned Stark came south, she greeted him not with fear, but with a smile so thin it could slice bone, because this version of Cersei never had the comfort of a brother's love to keep her soft. When Robert died, it was not through a boar's tusk but a poisoned cup. A slow, choking death after a feast. No one suspected her. She cried the loudest at his funeral. Her black-haired son became king, a weak boy, kind, too soft, too much like Robert. But she kept him on the throne, a puppet with lion strings. Jaime returned briefly to King's Landing during her son's coronation. He looked at her like he didn't recognize her anymore, and she smiled at him, cool and cruel. "I've become everything you ran from, haven't I?" He didn't answer, but she saw it in his eyes, regret. Good. He tried to speak to her that night, tried to explain why he left, why he stayed away, but she shut the door on him mid-sentence. "You don't get to speak to me like we're still the same blood," she said through the door. "You chose a white cloak over me. I chose the world, and now the world would burn for her." The boy king, Maelon Baratheon, sat on the Iron Throne with feet that barely reached the floor. Cersei stood behind him like a lioness, guarding a lamb she didn't love. The court bowed to him, but they feared her. She wore black and gold now, always. Red was too warm. She wanted to be seen as untouchable, not a grieving widow, not a queen mother, a force. Maelon, sweet and stupid, asked her once why she never smiled at him. She turned her face away. "Because I see your father in your eyes." He stopped asking questions after that. In this world, with no Jaime to protect her or soften her rage, Cersei grew crueler, sharper. She played the Game of Thrones, with both hands and no heart, and her moves were ruthless. She began with the small council. She replaced Grand Maester Pycelle with a younger, more obedient man, Maester Orin, one who knew where his loyalties lay. When Stannis questioned the king's parentage, she had ravens sent to Dragonstone bearing false letters forged in Stannis' hand, threatening assassination and treason. Within weeks, a small fleet attacked Dragonstone, all under the pretense of protecting Maelon's reign. Stannis burned, not by wildfire, but by royal decree. She never told her son what she'd done. He wouldn't have understood. He still believed. In honor, in right and wrong. He'd inherited none of her fire. When Renly made his move for the throne, she used spies in Highgarden to spread rumors of his unnatural affections. The Reach pulled its support within a month, fearing scandal. Renly died shortly after, throat slit in his own tent. Brienne of Tarth was blamed, vanished before trial. Cersei paid good coin to ensure she never resurfaced. Every threat to her, boy's throne, she snuffed out, but not for love, for control. Meanwhile, Jaime stayed in the Kingsguard, fulfilling duties without affection. He never questioned her rule, but he never supported it either. They passed each other like ghosts. In the Red Keep, sometimes she'd catch him watching her, like he wanted to say something, but she didn't care. His silence was easier than apologies, but it was Tyrion who finally tried to reach her. He returned to King's Landing after a long stint in the Vale, half-drunk and full of schemes. He bowed mockingly before the Iron Throne and said, "I see. The lioness hasn't grown tired of ruling her sheep." "Careful, little brother," she said with a smile. "I have fewer reasons to keep you alive than I used to." He raised his goblet. "And yet, here I stand." He tried to warn her, told her the people were starving, that whispers of rebellion stirred in Flea Bottom, that the North would not stay quiet forever. But Cersei waved him off. "I'm not afraid of wolves." "No," Tyrion replied. "You should be afraid of silence. That's what comes before screaming." But she didn't listen. She was building something bigger, her own dynasty. With Robert gone and Jaime no longer a father to her children, Cersei saw her legacy in stone and crown. Her plan was already forming. If Maelon died, too soft, too kind, she would replace him with another, a younger son, fiercer, one she could shape like iron in fire. So she began crafting alliances, courting the Martells in secret, promising lands to the Greyjoys, feeding lies to the Vale, whispering dreams of power to young lords who'd lost their fathers in Robert's rebellion. She was weaving a web bigger than anyone could see, and through it all she kept her distance from Jaime. Cold, distant, punishing him the only way she could now, by living without him. But in the dark corners of the castle, where wine ran thicker than water, rumors began to grow. Whispers that Cersei had poisoned Robert, that Stannis never lifted a sword, that Renly was lured into a trap, that the Queen had blackmail on half the court and knives in the backs of the rest. She dismissed them as gossip, until one night Maelon came to her chambers with wide, tearful eyes. "Did you kill father?" Cersei stood from her vanity. Her hair was pinned in gold. Her mouth tightened. She said nothing. The boy looked crushed. I heard it from the kitchen servants, that you hated him, that you laughed at his funeral." Cersei approached slowly. "Who told you this?" "I don't know. It doesn't matter." His voice broke. "Is it true?" She cupped his face with hands that had never once held him like a mother should. And then she whispered, "Would it matter if it was?" He blinked. She could see the little fire inside him flickering, trying to make sense of a world that didn't love him the way he thought it did. Maelon pulled away. "I don't want to be king anymore," she smiled. "Then you're not fit to be." That night, the boy king locked himself in his chambers and didn't come out for 3 days. Cersei didn't knock. She had already begun writing letters to Dawn. It was time to prepare her second son for the throne. Malin died in his sleep. They said it was fever. The Maester blamed summer chills, too much wine, and too little strength. But the whispers behind tapestries told a different story. Poison, quiet, painless. Cersei wore black again, not out of grief, but to keep up appearances. Her face at the funeral was the perfect mask, tears that never reached her eyes, hands folded like a penitent saint. The people lined the streets, tossing flowers they couldn't afford. The boy king had been kind, gentle, too gentle, and now he was gone. Tyrion approached her afterward. He didn't speak at first, just stood by her side as the body was lowered. Into the crypt, finally he said, "You'll never love anything the way you loved Jaime, not even your own blood." Cersei didn't turn. "That love made me weak," he raised his brows. "It made you human." "I'm not interested in being human, Tyrion. I'm interested in being remembered." He nodded, drained the last of his wine and walked away without another word. The court was stunned by Malin's death, but Cersei didn't let their confusion linger long. Before the sun rose again, she declared her second son Varon king. Varon was only 5, small, silver-eyed, with golden curls. He looked more like a Lannister than any Baratheon ever had. Because he wasn't Roberts. He was never Roberts. The child was the result of a short, secret affair with a high-born knight from Old Town. Young, ambitious, dead before the bedding sheets cooled. Cersei had planned it all. She needed a child to mold, a weapon, a true heir of her choosing, and Varon was perfect. She held court with him in her lap, smiling at nobles like a doting mother. The lords believed the tale, a posthumous child conceived in Robert's final days. They didn't question it, yet. The boy was charming, bright, and, unlike Malin, he already showed signs of cruelty. He crushed birds in the garden, laughed when his cat scratched a servant's eye out. Cersei saw it as strength, but the realm had begun to rot. The North had grown quiet after Ned Stark's execution, too quiet. Robb Stark had gathered his bannermen, and though he hadn't declared war yet, everyone could feel it building. The Riverlands boiled with tension. House Tully refused to send envoys to King's Landing. The Vale murmured rebellion. Even Dawn, once courted by Cersei's flatteries, had grown cold. The streets of King's Landing stank of sewage and resentment. The bakeries couldn't keep flour. The gold cloaks turned blind eyes to theft and murder. And through it all, the small folk spoke in whispers. The lioness kills her own. The boy was never Robert's. She's cursed. All her children will die. The faith began to stir again too. The High Septon preached of divine justice, of unnatural queens who rose above their place, of sinners who wore crowns. Cersei met with him once in secret, offering coin and land and silence. But the old man only bowed and said, "Gold cannot bribe the gods, your grace." She left the sept that day with a cold smile. "The gods won't save you," she whispered to herself, "and they won't save me. But I'll still win." She returned to the Red Keep to find a raven waiting from the twins. Robb Stark had married a Frey girl and crossed the neck. The war had begun. Jaime approached her not long after. She was staring into the fireplace in her chambers when he stepped in without knocking. She didn't look at him. "You look like you haven't slept," he said softly. "I don't," she replied. He moved closer. "Cersei, people are afraid. They say you—" She stood, her eyes flashing like wildfire. "Do you think I care what they say? I am queen, I rule, and if they hate me, good. Let them choke on their own fear." Jaime frowned. "This isn't you." She laughed bitterly. "This is exactly me. This is who I've always been. You were just too blind to see it." He reached out gently. "I never wanted this for you." She stepped back. "You never wanted me at all. Don't pretend otherwise." The air between them thickened. The old warmth, that unspoken bond they'd once shared, was long dead. Jaime's voice cracked. "I still—" "Don't," she snapped. "Don't lie to me. You had a choice. You left, and now I am everything you feared. And I will not stop until every one of them kneels or burns." She turned away, dismissing him like a servant. But once the door closed, she stood there in silence, one hand clenched so tightly around her wine goblet that it shattered, red spilling. Down her wrist like blood. She didn't flinch. Cersei stood atop the battlements of the Red Keep as smoke curled on the horizon. The banners of the north were closer now, dire wolves on grey, advancing slowly from the riverlands, burning everything in their path. Robb Stark had become more than a boy with a banner. He was a symbol now, of justice, of vengeance, of the realm's thirst to be rid of the lioness on the throne. Inside the city, whispers turned into curses. The people no longer bowed when her litter passed. Some threw rotten fruit. A butcher's son was caught hissing "Kingslayer's whore" near the sept and lost 3 fingers for it. Fear had been her shield once. Now it curdled around her like bad wine. Tyrion tried to speak with her again, but she had stopped listening. He warned her of dwindling stores, of unpaid sellswords, of lords deserting her cause. "You've made too many enemies," he said, sitting on the edge of her war map, sipping from his goblet. "Even the stones are starting to hate you." "They hated our grandfather too," Cersei snapped, "and he ruled them all the same. Our grandfather didn't poison his own children." She slapped him, hard. Her palms stung, but it was worth the silence that followed. Tyrion stood, wiped the blood from his mouth, and looked her dead in the eye. "You don't deserve the throne. You don't even want it. You just want to punish the world for not being Jaime." She didn't respond, not with words. Just turned and walked out, her black skirts trailing like smoke. That night she called the pyromancers. The same men who had whispered to the Mad King before his end now stood trembling before her. She ordered wildfire, kegs of it, stored beneath the city, beneath the sept, beneath the gates, beneath the Blackwater Bay. "If they come for me," she said coldly, "I want this city to burn before they touch me." The pyromancers nodded, some pale with fear, some smiling too much. Madness was a language they spoke fluently. Jaime heard of her plan and came storming into her solar one storm-lashed evening. He was drenched from the rain, his white cloak smeared with mud and fury. "You're going to burn the city?" he shouted. "If I must. You've become worse than Aerys." At least he had madness for an excuse. She stood slowly, her voice soft, dangerous. "You were sworn to protect Aerys, and you killed him. Who protects me from you, Kingslayer?" Jaime looked wounded, more than he ever had in battle. "I don't want to be your enemy, Cersei. But you're not my ally," she said. "You never were." For the first time in her life, she watched as Jaime broke. He didn't yell, didn't strike. He just walked away, and this time she knew he would not come back. She drank deeply that night, wine and thoughts, sat on the Iron Throne herself, barefoot, her gold crown resting on her lap. She missed him, not the Jaime he had become, but the boy with whom she'd once shared secrets in the dark. The one who knew her favorite fruit, her worst fear, her dream of ruling not beside a man, but above them all. That Jaime was long gone, and in his absence she had sharpened herself into a sword too heavy to hold. The next morning, the gates of King's Landing were lined with refugees. Thousands pushed in from the countryside, fleeing wolves, fleeing war, begging for protection, food, water, anything. Cersei gave orders to close the gates. No more mouths to feed. Let them die outside. The walls. A riot broke out by noon, fires by dusk. The Red Keep became a fortress again. The court dared not leave its walls, and the ravens brought more news. River Run had fallen, Storm's End declared for Stark. The Reach had split, half for the wolf, half waiting to see which lion bleeds first. Inside her chambers, Cersei read every Scroll with calm fingers and a numb heart. When Varen came to her that evening, scared by the sounds of screaming outside the keep, she pulled him into her lap. "Am I going to die like Malin?" he asked. She stroked his hair, not out of love, but habit. "No, you'll be stronger than Malin." "But everyone hates us," he said. Cersei kissed his forehead. "Then we'll rule through fear. That's what lions do." Outside, the bells of the great sept rang for the dead. Cersei sipped her wine and imagined the city aflame. Not with fear this time, but freedom. Hers. The war drum stopped echoing days before the wolves arrived. King's Landing held its breath while black smoke loomed like a crown of thorns above the city. On the fourth morning from the Red Keep's tower, Cersei watched a sea of grey and white rise from the horizon. Banners bearing direwolves, soldiers armored in furs and steel, and a young king atop a black stallion, Robb Stark. He didn't look like a boy anymore. No softness in his jaw, no fear in his eyes. Only the cold resolve of someone who had lost everything and planned to take everything in return. "He looks so much like his father," Jaime said quietly beside her. Cersei didn't look at him. "Then he'll die just like him." But her voice lacked venom. Even she could feel it. The war had changed her, or maybe it had only revealed her fully. The masks were gone. The lies didn't matter now. What mattered was survival, and survival was slipping fast. Her spies had gone silent in the Riverlands. Gold from the treasury had thinned to copper. The Iron Bank of Braavos stopped responding. Even her most loyal bannermen were sending fewer men and more excuses. The city was sick, dying from the inside, while wolves scratched at its bones. The small folk had begun chanting in the streets again. "Robb the Just," they called him. "The boy who would free the realm from the mad queen." She spat on the stone floor when she first heard it. Tyrion stood in the war room, arms crossed, as reports came flooding in. "Half the gold cloaks have abandoned their posts. The rest are taking bribes to keep the peace." Cersei swirled her wine. Then, "Raise the city gates and let them meet their end. You don't have the men to fight them off. I have wildfire." Tyrion stared. "You're really going to do it?" "If the choice is between my crown and this city," she said flatly, "the city burns." He shook his head. "You're not even trying to win anymore. You just want to destroy whatever." "You can't hold," she stepped close. "I want them to remember me, not as a mother, not as a wife, as a force." "And Varen?" Tyrion asked. "What will he remember you as?" Cersei didn't answer. She had stopped thinking of Varen as a child. He was an heir, a tool, a vessel to carry on her name, nothing more. The next day, Robb Stark sent terms. The Raven arrived mid-morning, short, precise, brutal. "Surrender, kings. Landing, relinquish the throne. You and your son will be exiled to Casterly Rock under armed guard. Any resistance will be met with fire and steel." Cersei read the letter once, then again. Then she burned it. No wolf tells a lion when to kneel. That evening she summoned the pyromancers. They had prepared everything, kegs of wildfire beneath the sept of Baelor, beneath the city walls, beneath Flea Bottom, and the last cache, the largest, right below the great sept's crypt. Enough. To light the sky green for days. Jaime barged into her chambers before midnight. "You can't do this." She poured wine, slow and deliberate. "You keep saying that." He stepped forward. "You're going to kill thousands of innocent people." "If it makes the realm fear the lion again, then yes." He looked at her like he didn't recognize her anymore. "Cersei, please, there's still a chance. We can negotiate. You can end this without blood." She laughed bitterly. "You think Robb Stark wants peace. He wants revenge. He wants my head and our legacy buried beneath the stones. He won't stop until I'm nothing, and I'd rather burn the city than let him have that satisfaction." Jaime's fists clenched. "Then you are no better than Aerys." Cersei met his gaze. "Then you better kill me, Kingslayer." Again, a long silence. Jaime stepped back, pain carved across his face like stone. You were right. I never deserved you. But gods help me. I loved you. Her eyes burned, but not with tears, with fury. Regret, power. You loved a version of me that never existed, she whispered. Now go. Be the knight you always wanted to be. Save the people. He left, and she called for her son. Varen came, rubbing sleep from his eyes, wearing a little. Crown too big for his head, mother. She knelt, brushing his curls back. If anything happens, she whispered, if they break through the gates, I want you to run. Go with Sir Gregor to the tunnel beneath the tower. There'll be a ship waiting. Sail west. Never look back. But you're coming too. She kissed his forehead. Of course. She lied, because in her heart Cersei knew she wasn't leaving. If her reign ended, it would end in fire, and in fire it would be remembered. Outside the city walls, the war horns blew. The siege had begun. The siege began at dawn, when the mist still clung to the Blackwater Bay like the breath of old ghosts. Arrows hissed through the air. Siege towers creaked against stone. The wolves were at the gates in force, not as raiders, but as kings come to claim a corpse. From atop the Red Keep, Cersei watched the city scream. Smoke rose from the slums first. The outer walls crumbled by midday. Stark forces poured in, disciplined and relentless. They didn't rape. They didn't burn. They moved like a cold, punishing wind, cutting through Lannister resistance with mechanical grace. It almost insulted her, their civility, as if they thought they were better, holier. She wanted to spit from the window. By nightfall, Fleabottom was lost. Her command chamber stank of sweat and fear. The few lords who remained clutched wine like lifelines. Pyromancer Belric, the old fool with wild green eyes, stood beside her map, murmuring of spark points and calculated ignition routes. You give the word, your grace, he whispered. And we'll light the fire. No man, no woman, no child will survive. Jaime burst through the doors. He wasn't wearing his Kingsguard whites. He wore black armor, unmarked, not lion, not crown. Just a knight with a golden hand and a broken heart. You will not burn this city, he said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear. Belric stammered, looking between them. Cersei tilted her head. Who do you speak for now? The people? The wolves? Yourself? Jaime moved closer, sword drawn. I'm speaking for the realm. Tyrion was there too, standing off to the side, eyes tired, skin pale. He'd known this confrontation was coming. He just hadn't expected to see Jaime pick a side. You're going to kill everyone, Jaime said. And for what? A throne of ash. Cersei's eyes burned. For the legacy you abandoned, for the son you never claimed, for the lion that still roars, even as the world forgets her name. She stepped toward him, close enough to feel the pain trembling in his breath. You loved me once, enough to kill a king. Do it again, or get out of my way. Jaime looked at her for a long, broken second. Then he did something Cersei never expected. He dropped his sword. I won't kill you, he said. But I won't help you destroy this city either. She stared at him, then turned to the pyromancer. Light. It. The order hung in the air, but no one moved. Belric looked from her to Tyrion, to Jaime, and then to the map. My queen, he whispered. I can't. Cersei's eyes narrowed. What did you say? I can't, he repeated, voice shaking. The wildfire, the caches under the sept and the black cells, they're gone. Tyrion stepped forward. I moved them, weeks ago. Silence struck like lightning. You? She hissed. Yes, he said. I knew you'd do this. I knew the moment you felt. Cornered, you'd choose fire. You always do. Cersei's face went pale with rage. You traitorous little... I saved thousands, Tyrion interrupted. I saved this city from its queen. She lunged for a blade, but Jaime was faster. In one smooth motion he stepped between them, catching her wrist. Don't, he said softly. Don't make me be the Kingslayer twice." She stared at him, her brother, her twin, the ghost of her past, and saw it in his eyes, love still lingering like smoke. And a wall behind it she would never break through again. She let the knife clatter to the floor, but she wasn't done. Not yet. Cersei turned to her most loyal guard, Sir Mervyn, tall, brutal, silent, and nodded. He moved fast, drawing his sword, and lunging at Tyrion, but Jaime blocked him, steel clashing in a shriek of sparks. The room exploded into motion, blades drawn, men shouting, guards falling. Cersei ran. She swept Varen into her arms from his chamber, wrapped in a cloak as the keep shook from distant catapults. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice soft, distant, mechanical. Varen clung to her, terrified. "Where are we going?" "Away from wolves," she said, "where no one will ever find us." Jaime followed the trail of blood and guards down into the lower passages of the Red Keep, Tyrion limping behind him. "She's going for the tunnels," Tyrion panted. "She'll use the old mine shafts beneath the tower. She's going to flee." Then we stop her. By the time they reached the hidden entrance, they saw the tunnel had collapsed. Rubble, flame, dust. No trace of her. Jaime stood there breathless, silent. "She's gone," he said. Tyrion looked at the wreckage and said nothing, because deep in his bones he knew she wasn't done yet. The lioness still had claws. Weeks passed, then months. The war ended not with wildfire, but with snow. Robb Stark took King's Landing, not by fire and steel, but by siege and silence. The Red Keep fell with barely a scream. Robb never claimed the Iron Throne. He gave it to a council of lords, dissolving the monarchy and restoring rule to the great houses. The realm, bleeding and shaken, wanted no more kings. They buried the throne, melted it down. No one had seen Cersei since the collapse of the tunnel beneath the keep. Most believed she died in the rubble, crushed beneath stone. Buried with the last remains of her legacy, the people celebrated. Taverns sang crude songs about her fall. Children played in the streets, pretending to push queens into fire. The lioness was dead, they said. They were wrong. In the western cliffs of Casterly Rock, far below the old mine shafts, a small boat docked under moonlight. Two cloaked figures disembarked, one tall, one small, clinging to the other's hand. It was her, alive. Cersei had fled with gold stitched into her gown, and enough coin to buy silence from a dozen guards. She'd escaped the tunnel collapse through an ancient shaft used centuries ago by smugglers. Only a few knew the way. Now she hid in the hollowed chambers beneath her family's ancestral home. No servants, no banners, just stone, shadow, and her son. Varen cried every night for weeks. He didn't understand why there was no fire, no feast, no throne. He begged for warm bread, for knights to guard his bed. But there were no knights left. Not for them. Cersei didn't cry. She taught him to eat in silence, to hold his breath when they heard steps above, to wait, because waiting was all they had. She read old books by candlelight, spoke to no one, watched the sea crash against the cliffs like it wanted to swallow the rock whole. But she wasn't broken. She was calculating. The world believed she was dead. Good. They would forget her, stop looking, and when they grew soft again, she would rise. She whispered to Varen every night, "You are still a king." He'd nod, eyes wide and scared. "I'm still a king." But as months turned into a year, the boy grew quiet, pale, afraid of light, coughing blood into his sheets. There were no meisters left, no medicine, no one to help. And one night, he didn't wake. Cersei sat beside his tiny body. For hours, she didn't scream, didn't weep. She washed him with ocean water, wrapped him in a lion-embroidered cloak, carried him into the deepest cave beneath the rock, and buried him with her bare hands. No tombstone, no song, just stone. Her last legacy, gone. And yet, she lived. because hate does not die with love. It calcifies. One night, she climbed the tower and looked out at the world that had moved on without her. The realm was rebuilding. The small folk laughed again, houses realigned, the wolves ruled from Winterfell, the dragons had vanished, and the throne was gone. And yet, she remained. The lioness without her cubs, the queen without her kingdom. She whispered into the dark, "You think you've forgotten me." The waves answered with silence, "But I remember all of you." Years passed. Cersei Lannister became a name buried under ash and silence. History books called her the Mad Queen who burned her blood. Though the wildfire never lit, bards sang about her fall with glee, their songs full of poison and embellishment. The world moved on, eager to forget the woman who once ruled with gold, seduction, and steel. But in the deep chambers of Casterly Rock, she still breathed, old now. Her hair turned to silver, but her eyes remained sharp, yellow as a lion's. No longer a queen, no longer a mother, but not broken, not gone, only waiting. Her days were quiet. She spoke to no one. Her voice, once used to command lords and terrify kings, now whispered only to ghosts, to Jaime, to Maelon, to Varon. Sometimes she'd imagine them still there, Jaime by the window, polishing his sword, Maelon playing with carved lions, Varon clinging to her gown, whispering, "I'm still a king." The madness was soft now, not violent, just constant. Like an old friend with cold hands. Then one morning a raven landed. She hadn't received a raven in years. The bird wore no sigil. The parchment was tied with plain twine. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers, half expecting poison ink or one last cruel joke from the gods. But it was simple. "You are not forgotten." No name, no seal, no threat. She stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in over a decade, Cersei laughed. That night, she rode alone. She wore a black cloak stitched with old gold thread, dusted from the depths of her past. Her boots were cracked, her dagger dull, but her resolve shone like polished iron. She headed east. Not to King's Landing. It was no longer hers. Not to Winterfell. It was filled with ghosts she didn't want to meet. She travelled from village to village. Nameless, the old called her my lady. Children feared her pale eyes. She spoke little, ate less, watched everything. In secret she began sending ravens, old debts, quiet favours, assassins and informants. There were still those who feared the Lannister name. Still those who hated the wolves, still those who whispered, "She's not dead, she's just waiting." And slowly, rumours began again. A fire in a Tarly outpost, a poisoned cup in Old Town, a lord's son found hanged with lion claws carved into his chest. No one claimed responsibility, but whispers started to spread again. The lioness is alive. She's hunting. She's coming for those who took her throne. Cersei moved through the chaos like a shadow of war. She had no army, no banners, but fear is an army of its own, and Cersei wielded it like a blade. Then, one stormy night, she reached the outskirts of Winterfell, the new capital, the seat of the Council of Lords. Robb Stark, older now, bearded, a symbol of peace, sat inside with his children, his wife, his soft dreams of rebuilding the realm. He had no guards posted. Outside the walls, not anymore. No one thought the war would come again. Not from a ghost. Cersei stood at the edge of the woods, soaked in rain, her cloak dripping black onto the mud. Her fingers brushed the hilt of the dagger at her hip. She could end it all. Walk into the halls of the wolf and take what he took from her, make him bleed for Ned, for Maelon, for the silence of her legacy. But something inside her stopped, not mercy, not fear. Exhaustion, the long ache of being forgotten, of surviving long past, the moment she mattered. She turned away, No guards saw her. No one ever would. She walked into the woods, disappearing beneath the pines like a shadow, folding into dusk, and that is where she remained, never captured, never crowned, but never forgotten. In time, stories returned, of a woman with lion's eyes who walked the edges of battlefields, who whispered to ravens, who made kings and queens wake in the night, terrified of the sound of soft footsteps in the dark. Children grew up afraid of fire, afraid of wine in gold cups, afraid of queens who smiled too wide, and sometimes they said, if the wind was right and the night was long, you could hear her voice. A lion does not weep. A lion does not kneel. A lion remembers. And in the end, that was her victory. Not power, not a throne, but fear, forever. The end.